The day Esther Shelton buried her second neighbor in 6 months, she did not cry, not because she had no tears left, but because she had learned long ago that grief had to wait its turn behind the living who still needed her. Dust Creek, Texas, in the year 1879, was not a town that pampered its residents. It sat between two low ridges like something the land had coughed up and forgotten about. A scatter of wooden buildings bleached pale by the relentless sun. A church whose steeple had been struck by lightning twice and rebuilt by hand each time. A general store. A livery. A saloon that held more secrets than a confessional. And a well in the center of the main street that everyone gathered around in the morning, the way people in softer places gathered around a warm fire. The railroad had not reached Dust Creek yet, and the men who ran cattle through the valley took the longer route east, which meant Dust Creek was left mostly to its own devices, its own joys, its own troubles, and its own dead. Esther Shelton was 31 years old, a widow herself, which was something people in town sometimes forgot because she never wore her grief the way other women did. Her husband, Thomas Shelton, had died 4 years prior of a fever that swept through Dust Creek with quiet brutality, taking him and 3 others in the span of 2 weeks. He had been a good man, a carpenter who built straight and true, who smelled of cedar shavings and linseed oil, and who had loved Esther in the uncomplicated way that good men love good women. She had mourned him properly and honestly, and then, because there was no alternative that made sense to her, she had gotten up and kept going. She had a small house on the east side of town, a vegetable garden that she tended with serious dedication, 2 chickens named Ruth and Margaret, and a reputation that had grown so quietly and so steadily over the years that she was hardly aware of the full shape of it herself. What she knew was this. When Clara Haynes's husband fell from his horse and broke his neck in the spring of 1877, it was Esther who sat with Clara through the night, who held her hands when they shook, who told her what to say to the children and what not to say, and who showed up the next 3 mornings to make sure there was breakfast on the table. When old Dorothea Marsh lost her Edwin to a heart that simply stopped one Sunday afternoon, it was Esther who organized the funeral, wrote the letters to Edwin's brothers in Missouri, and made sure Dorothea did not have to face a single practical matter alone in those first drowning weeks. When younger Sarah Finch, barely 23, with 2 small boys and a husband who had ridden out to settle a land dispute and never come back, found herself standing in her kitchen staring at the wall for an hour without blinking, it was Esther who someone fetched, because somehow everyone in Dust Creek knew that Esther was who you sent for. She never asked for this role. She never announced herself as the woman who held things together. She simply did what needed doing, and people noticed. And so the widows of Dust Creek came to her the way lost travelers come to a lit window, not because they were invited, but because the light was there. What nobody noticed, or nobody thought to notice, was that Esther Shelton came home every evening to a house that held only her own quiet, fed her 2 chickens, ate her supper standing at the kitchen window looking out at the ridge, and then sat in the chair by the lamp with a book open in her lap that she sometimes did not read at all, because her eyes would stop moving across the page, and she would simply sit there for a while with the kind of loneliness that has no dramatic shape to it, no sobbing or raging. Just a low and constant weight like a stone pressed against the chest. She was fine. She told herself this regularly, and she meant it. She was fine. Lionel Donnelly arrived in Dust Creek on a Thursday morning in early September of 1879, riding a bay gelding that looked like it had been through worse days than this one. He was 35 years old, built with the kind of lean, weathered solidity that came from years of working land and moving cattle, with dark hair going gray at the temples and green eyes that were striking enough that 3 women on the main street noticed them before they noticed anything else about him. He had a week's worth of beard, a duster coat the color of old rust, and a way of sitting in the saddle that suggested he was in no particular hurry, even when he was. He tied his horse in front of the livery and walked into the general store and asked the man behind the counter, a round, cheerful fellow named Horace Dunbar, if there was a property for sale on the east side of town. Horace Dunbar looked at him the way Dusk Creek residents always looked at newcomers, which was with a mixture of cautious curiosity and outright suspicion, barely dressed up as friendliness. "Might be," Horace said. "There's the old Beaumont place, half-mile east. Been sitting empty 2 years. You looking to farm or run cattle?" "Both, if the land holds," Lionel said. "It holds," Horace said, warming slightly to the idea of a working neighbor rather than a drifter. "Creek runs through the northeast corner. Decent water most of the year. Who do I say is asking?" "Lionel Donnelly. Out of Abilene most recently." Horace shook his hand. Lionel bought a tin of tobacco and a box of matches and walked back out into the September heat, and that was his arrival in Dusk Creek, quiet and unremarkable and easily forgotten, except that it was not forgotten, because Dusk Creek was small enough that a new face was news for a week. Esther heard about him that same afternoon from Clara Haynes, who had heard from Margaret Prout, who had spoken briefly with Horace Dunbar's wife. Clara was sitting at Esther's kitchen table while Esther made tea, which in September meant a lukewarm infusion because the stove heated the small house past comfortable even with the back door open. "He's buying the Beaumont place," Clara said, clearly expecting this to mean something. "Good," Esther said. "It's been an eyesore sitting empty. He's not married, apparently." Esther set 2 cups down on the table and looked at Clara steadily. "That is not my concern. I'm only saying." "I know what you are only saying, Clara." Clara had the grace to look slightly chastened, and then she laughed, which was something she could do now, laugh again, and that, Esther thought with quiet satisfaction, was everything. Esther did not think about Lionel Donnelly that evening. She had other things to think about. Sarah Finch had come by that morning to say that the bank was talking about calling in a note on the Finch property, and Esther had spent part of the afternoon composing a letter on Sarah's behalf to the bank manager in the county seat, which had required careful and firm language, and 3 drafts before she was satisfied with it. She proofread the final version by lamplight, folded it, sealed it, and set it by the door to post in the morning. Then she sat in her chair and the quiet settled around her, and the stone pressed against her chest, and she read 4 pages of the novel she was making her way through and then set it down and looked at the lamp for a while. She was fine. Lionel Donnelly, meanwhile, was sleeping in the livery with his horse, having made an agreement with old Calhoun, who ran the place to use the empty stall in exchange for 2 days of labor. He lay on his back in the straw listening to the horse breathe and the night insects outside the walls, and he thought about the piece of land he had seen in the fading afternoon light, the dry grass fields, the line of cottonwoods along the creek, the sagging fence that would need replacing, the farmhouse with its broken shutters and its front porch boards rotting through in one corner. He had seen worse. He had bought worse once in Kansas, and made it into something that a decent man could be proud of, before the drought took everything in the summer of 1876, and he had packed what remained and ridden south. He was not a man who talked about his losses easily. He had learned this about himself by watching what happened when he did. People pitied him, which was worse than silence. He had also learned that loss was a country everyone eventually traveled through, and the only meaningful question was whether you came out the other side still capable of building something. He believed he was. He closed his eyes and listened to his horse breathe and thought about the creek running through the northeast corner of the Beaumont property, and somewhere in those thoughts he drifted into sleep. He met Esther Shelton for the first time on a Saturday, 4 days after his arrival, under circumstances that were entirely unremarkable, and yet somehow felt, afterward, like a scene he would return to in his memory more than once. He was at the post office, which was a window cut into the wall of the general store, with Horace Dunbar presiding over it as well as his regular commerce, collecting general delivery mail that had been forwarded from Abilene. He was standing at the window reading a letter when he heard the door open and looked up automatically, the way a man does when he has spent years being careful about who enters a room. She came in with a letter in her hand and a purposeful expression on her face, and she walked straight to the post office window without looking at him, which he found interesting because most people, entering a room where a stranger stood, did at least glance. She handed her letter to Horace and said something quiet about making sure it went on the next mail stage, and Horace took it and told her it would, and then she turned to leave, and that was when she looked at him. Not a prolonged look, not a sizing up, just a brief direct acknowledgement of his presence the way a competent person acknowledges the world around them. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he said. She nodded and walked out. The door settled behind her. Horace was grinning at him. "That's Esther Shelton," he said with the air of a man delivering important information. "She runs things around here." "Does she?" Lionel said, folding his letter. "Not officially, but if you need to know how Dust Creek actually works, ask her." Lionel tucked the letter into his coat pocket. "I'll keep that in mind." He thought about that brief exchange for longer than was warranted, he acknowledged to himself. There had been something in the way she moved, not hurried, not slow, but completely purposeful, as though she had calculated the exact amount of energy required for each action and deployed it with precision. He had known men in the cavalry who moved like that. He had not expected to see it in a woman in a post office in a small Texas town. He bought the Beaumont property the following Monday. It cost him most of what he had saved in 2 years of trail work and a little cash advance against the first season's crop, which the land bank agreed to on account of Horace Dunbar vouching for him as a steady sort of man. He rode out to the property on Tuesday morning and stood in the middle of the front yard for a long moment looking at everything that needed doing, and then he took off his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and started on the front porch. He was working on the porch, pulling the rotted boards with a pry bar, stacking them in a pile for burning, when he heard a wagon on the east road and looked up. It was a small buckboard, 1 horse, driven by a woman in a gray dress and a wide-brimmed hat. She pulled up at his fence line and sat there for a moment as though deciding something, and then climbed down with a basket over her arm. He put down the pry bar and walked to the fence. Up close, closer than the post office had allowed, she was a different kind of interesting. She had brown eyes that were direct to the point of being disconcerting, and a face that was neither soft nor hard but something more honest than either, the face of a person who had felt real things and continued anyway. "Esther Shelton," she said. She did not offer her hand because the fence was between them and it would have been awkward, but there was something almost formal in the way she said her own name, as though she considered it important that a person know who they were talking to. "Lionel Donnelly," he said. "We met briefly at the post office. I remember." She held the basket out. "Corn bread and a jar of pickles. It's custom here to welcome new neighbors." He took the basket. "That's very kind, thank you." "It's custom," she said again, not unkindly but plainly, as though she wanted to be clear this was not a personal gesture. "You will find Dust Creek is particular about its customs. The Beaumont place has been empty a while. People are glad to see it occupied." "I intend to make it worth occupying," he said. She looked at the porch he was rebuilding and then at the pry bar on the ground and then at him. "You are doing the work yourself. For now. I may hire help for the roof. Calhoun's oldest boy, James, he does roofing work. He is reliable and he does not overcharge. Ask at the livery." "I will, thank you." She nodded and picked up her reins. He watched her go and then stood at the fence holding the basket for a moment after she had disappeared around the bend, and he thought that Horace Dunbar had described her correctly. She was a woman who ran things, not with noise or declaration, but with the quiet authority of someone who understood what a situation needed and supplied it without waiting to be asked. He found that he was curious about her in a way that surprised him slightly, because he had not been particularly curious about anyone in some time. September moved into October, and Lionel settled into the rhythms of Dust Creek. He worked the Beaumont property from sunup to late afternoon, rebuilding fence sections and repairing the house, and turning the kitchen garden that had gone wild with weeds back into something that might actually produce food by the following spring. In the evenings, he sometimes walked into town and took supper at the small eating house that a woman named Helen Porter ran out of her own kitchen, serving whatever she had cooked that day to whoever came and wanted it. It was at Helen Porter's eating house that he first saw Esther in the context of the town rather than on her own ground, and what he saw shifted something further in his understanding of who she was. He was eating his supper beef stew, decent enough, when a young woman came in through the door with the particular look of someone who was barely holding themselves together by the seams. She was young, maybe 23 or 24, with red-rimmed eyes and the rigid posture of a person who was afraid that if they let go even slightly they would come completely undone. She looked around the room and her eyes landed on Esther, who was sitting 2 tables over eating alone, and something in the young woman visibly changed, the way a lost person's face changes when they finally see a landmark they recognize. "Mrs. Shelton," the young woman said. Esther was on her feet before the woman had finished saying her name. "Sarah." She crossed the room and took both of Sarah's hands in hers and spoke to her in a low voice that Lionel could not hear, and then she guided Sarah to her table and sat her down and called to Helen for another bowl of stew, and she sat with her and talked to her, and occasionally just sat in companionable silence while Sarah ate, because Sarah was clearly one of those people who needed feeding before they could do anything else. Lionel finished his supper and paid, and on his way out he paused near Esther's table, not to interrupt, just enough to catch her eye, and he tipped his hat slightly, and she gave him the same brief nod she had given him at the post office, acknowledging his presence without making anything of it. He walked home under a sky full of October stars and thought about what he had seen. He had watched a lot of people in his 35 years. He had watched the way people behaved when they thought no one important was watching. What Esther Shelton had done at Helen Porter's eating house was not performance. There was no audience she was playing to. She had simply seen a person who needed something and provided it, quickly and competently, and without calling any particular attention to herself. He wondered who saw her. He wondered if anyone did, in the complete way that a person wants to be seen. He reminded himself that this was not a question that was any of his business, and went to sleep. October in Dust Creek brought the first real relief from the summer heat, a lowering of the sky's brightness to something almost gentle, a crispness in the mornings that smelled of dry grass and distance. Lionel had the porch finished, the worst fence sections replaced, and had hired young James Calhoun for the roof, who was indeed reliable and showed up on time and worked without needing supervision. The house was coming along. It was in mid-October that Lionel found himself at a town meeting of sorts, not a formal affair, just a gathering at the church on a Saturday evening to discuss the matter of the school, which had been without a teacher since the previous spring when Miss Alderman had married a man from Dallas and left. There were 14 children in Dust Creek of school age, and without a teacher they were receiving their education haphazardly, which everyone agreed was not acceptable. Esther Shelton was sitting in the 3rd row. She had a small notebook open on her knee and a pencil in her hand, and she was writing things down while other people talked, which meant she was the only person in the room who was actually keeping track of what was being said. The discussion was circular for a while, the usual trouble being that a new teacher would need to be recruited, would need somewhere to live, would need a salary that the town's modest funds could barely cover. People went around and around this several times without making any progress, and Lionel watched Esther get quieter and quieter, which he was beginning to understand was a sign that she was thinking. Finally she said, "The county school board in Abilene has a placement service for certified teachers. I can write to them this week requesting candidates. For housing, the Carmichael House, which the town holds title to since the Carmichaels left in June, could be offered as a teacher's residence at no charge in lieu of part of the salary, which would reduce what we need to raise. I can calculate the exact figures and bring them to the next gathering." Silence for a moment, and then someone said, "That makes good sense, Esther," and the matter was essentially settled. Lionel raised his hand. "I can contribute $20 toward the teacher's fund." Every head turned toward him with a degree of curiosity that told him this was slightly unexpected from a man who had been in town less than 2 months and was barely established himself. He met Esther's eyes across the room. She was looking at him with an expression he could not quite read, not quite surprise, not quite approval, something more careful than either. "Thank you, Mr. Donnelly," she said. "That is generous." "It is practical," he said. "I intend to be here a long while. A town with an education is worth more than one without." He thought he saw the corner of her mouth move very slightly. Not quite a smile. Something that might become one, given favorable conditions. After the meeting, people filed out into the cool October evening, and Lionel found himself walking out at the same time as Esther, who had her notebook tucked under her arm and was moving with her characteristic efficiency toward wherever she was going next. "You write a fair hand," he said, because he had seen her notebook and it was the most neutral thing he could think of to say that was also true. She glanced at him sideways. "My mother was a teacher," she said. "In Virginia before the war, she believed in clear writing and clear thinking. She sounds like a sensible woman. She was." A brief pause. "She has been gone 8 years now. I am sorry. Thank you." She did not make it sentimental, just accepted the condolence cleanly and moved on. "You are from Kansas, I am told, before Abilene." "Mostly. I grew up in Ohio, went west at 20, stayed." "What brought you to Dust Creek specifically?" He considered the question. People rarely asked him things directly, and he found he appreciated that she did. "I heard the land was reasonable. The climate is better than Kansas for what I want to grow, and I was ready to stop moving." "What do you want to grow?" "Cotton, some corn, a kitchen garden, maybe a small orchard if the soil will hold apple trees." She stopped walking. They were at the corner of the main street where her road east diverged from the path he would take to the livery to collect his horse. She looked at him in the lamplight from the street, and there was something assessing in her expression, not unkind, just honest. "Apple trees take years to produce," she said. "Yes," he said. She seemed to consider this for a moment. "That is the answer of a man who intends to stay. I told you I was ready to stop moving." "People say many things," she said. It was not harsh, just clear. The voice of someone who had seen enough promises dissolve in the Texas heat to know the difference between intention and conviction. "They do," he agreed. "I suppose the only proof available is time." Another of those almost smiles. "Good evening, Mr. Donnelly." "Good evening, Mrs. Shelton." He collected his horse and rode out to the Beaumont property under the stars and thought about apple trees taking years and the expression on her face when he said he knew. November came in cold. Lionel had the roof repaired, the interior of the house cleaned and weatherproofed, a new wood stove installed in the main room, and had begun the work of breaking ground in the south field that would be prepared for spring planting. It was good, honest, exhausting work, and he fell asleep easily and woke early and was satisfied with the shape of his days in a way he had not been for a long while. He saw Esther around town regularly, at the post office, at the general store, once at the church where he had started attending services less for spiritual reasons than because it was where the community gathered. He noticed things about her with growing attention. The way she always knew where everyone was in a room, the way she moved toward need the way a compass needle moves toward north, the way she was capable of a particular dry humor that she deployed rarely and only when she was comfortable, which he thought was not often. He also noticed that she was almost always surrounded by the concerns of others, and almost never appeared to have a conversation that was about herself. People brought her their troubles and she received them and helped carry them, and then they thanked her and went away, and she stood alone at the end of it looking out at whatever was in front of her with that quiet, undemonstrative steadiness. It bothered him in a way he could not immediately name. He had supper one evening at the end of November at Helen Porter's, and Esther was there alone, which was unusual. She was eating quietly with a book propped against the salt cellar, and she looked up when he came in and gave him her customary nod, and he sat 2 tables away because he did not want to presume, and then after a moment decided that the distance was artificial and slightly ridiculous, and picked up his plate and moved to her table. "Do you mind?" he asked, standing. She looked at him and then at the chair and then back at him. "No," she said, with the deliberate simplicity of a person choosing honesty over social convention. He sat down. She marked her place in her book and set it aside, which he appreciated because it meant she was choosing to have a real conversation rather than just tolerating his presence. "What are you reading?" he asked. "George Eliot," she said. "Middlemarch, have you read it?" "I have not. I have heard it is ambitious." "It is about people who want more than the world around them will permit them," she said. "It is very good and also quite painful." He thought about that. "That describes a fair amount of life." "It does." She looked at him steadily. "How is the Beaumont property coming along?" "Better than I expected. The soil in the south field is deeper than it looked. I think it will do well with cotton." "The Beaumont family grew wheat," she said. "It never yielded well. The drainage is wrong for wheat in that location. You know the land around here thoroughly." "I have had 4 years to learn it," she said. "When Thomas died, my husband, I had to manage the property myself for a season while I decided what to keep and what to let go. You learn land quickly when you cannot afford not to." It was the most she had said about herself, unprompted, since he had known her. He did not make much of it, did not lean in or show the kind of excessive interest that would make a private person close up. He just received it quietly the way she received things from others. "What did you decide to keep?" he asked. "The house, the garden, Ruth and Margaret." "Those are people. Those are my chickens," he laughed. It was a real, unguarded laugh, and it surprised him slightly because he had not laughed like that in a while. She looked at him with an expression that was startled and then pleased, as though the laugh was something she had not expected and found she liked. "They are named for your mother?" he asked. "Ruth was my mother's name. Margaret was her sister, both gone now. It seemed fitting." "It is fitting," he said. They ate in silence for a comfortable moment, and then she said, "Why did you come to the meeting at the church last month? You had no obligation to." "I am part of this town now," he said. "That comes with obligations. Most new arrivals do not see it that way for at least a year. Then most new arrivals are making a mistake," he said. "A community is only what its members put into it." She was looking at him with that careful, assessing expression again. He held it without discomfort because he had nothing to hide, and she seemed to appreciate that. "You are an interesting man, Mr. Donnelly," she said. It was clearly intended as an observation, not a compliment, though it landed as both. "I am trying to be a useful one," he said. "I believe those are different things." "They are," she said, "but in my experience, interesting and useful rarely overlap. I am aware that I have not yet demonstrated the useful part to your satisfaction," he said. "I expect I will have opportunities." She picked up her fork again. "I expect you will," she said. They finished their supper talking about the school the county had responded to her letter, and there was a candidate, a young woman named Miss Bauer from San Antonio who had a certification and was interested in Dust Creek, and about the winter planting calendar, and about whether Helen Porter's pie had improved since August. Esther thought yes. He reserved judgment. It was one of the easiest conversations he had had in years, and when he walked home that night, he was aware of a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the stove he had left burning. December arrived, and with it a harder cold than Lionel had expected, a dry, biting cold that came off the ridges at night and made the ground ring like iron. He was laying in firewood for the winter, splitting logs in the yard with a steady mechanical rhythm, when James Calhoun showed up at his gate looking uncomfortable. "Mrs. Shelton sent for you," James said. Lionel set the axe down. "Is something wrong?" "Not wrong exactly," James said. "It's Mrs. Finch. Her boys are sick. Real sick. Croup, Doc Harriman thinks." Mrs. Shelton is over there, and she says she needs another pair of hands because Doc Harriman's wife is poorly too, and he can't stay overnight." Lionel pulled on his coat without hesitation. Sarah Finch's house was a 20-minute ride north of town. When he arrived, the situation was tense without being yet desperate. Two small boys, 4 and 6 years old, both with the barking cough that croup produced, both feverish, both scared. Sarah herself was pale and red-eyed, moving between the two cots that had been set up by the main fire with the concentrated frantic energy of a mother trying to be everywhere at once. Esther was in the kitchen boiling water for the steam tent that was the main treatment available to them, moving with the calm efficiency that was her constant signature. She looked up when he came in and gave him a look of practical relief, not personal, just the relief of someone who needed a particular thing and now had it. "The larger pot needs to stay at a steady boil," she said. "The stove runs hot on the left side and the pot has a habit of boiling dry if you are not watching it. Can you manage that while I stay with the boys?" "Yes," he said. "Refill from the barrel by the back door. Keep it steady." He managed the stove. She managed the boys. Sarah held her children's hands and talked to them and sang to them in a small, shaking voice. And Esther moved between preparing the steam and keeping the boys calm and checking their breathing with the same quiet, unrelenting competence that he was coming to understand was not performance or effort for her. It was simply who she was. They were there all night. The boys' croup peaked around 2 in the morning. The worst of it, a stretch of 2 hours during which the younger one, a boy named Henry, could not catch his breath properly, and all of them stood in a particular kind of terror that parents and those who love children know and dread. Esther held him upright against her chest, angled the steam tent, talked to him in a low, continuous murmur that he could feel through her chest even when he could not hear the words, and slowly, the spasm released and his breathing eased, and he cried with the exhausted relief of a small animal let out of a trap, and Sarah Finch sobbed once sharply, and then pressed both hands over her mouth and composed herself. By 4 in the morning both boys were sleeping and their fevers were dropping. Esther was sitting in a chair between the two cots with her hands folded in her lap, watching their breathing. Lionel sat across the room with a cup of coffee he had made from Sarah's stores, and Sarah had fallen asleep in the rocking chair with a quilt over her. The house was quiet except for the fire and the small sounds of sleeping children. Lionel looked at Esther across the room. She was still watching the boys, but something in her posture had changed very slightly from the sustained alertness of the night. She looked tired, finally, genuinely tired, the kind of tired that lives behind the eyes. "You should rest," he said quietly so as not to wake Sarah. "I will when I am sure they are stable," she said. "They are stable." She glanced at him. "I will rest when I am sure," she repeated, gently, not as a rebuke. He watched her for a moment. The lamplight was low and warm, and the room smelled of steam and wood smoke, and whatever herb she had added to the water to help with the breathing. She looked, he thought, like someone who had been holding something extremely heavy for a very long time, and had simply adjusted her posture to accommodate the weight so thoroughly that she no longer appeared to be straining. "Who do you call when you need someone?" he asked quietly. She turned to look at him. The question seemed to land differently than the usual things people said. She was quiet for a moment. "I manage," she said. It was not defensive, but it was careful. "That is not what I asked." Another silence. The fire settled. One of the boys, the older one, whose name was Caleb, turned in his sleep, and his breathing remained even, and they both listened to it instinctively. "I have not needed to call anyone," she said at last. "I have been fine." He looked at her steadily. "You are at this woman's house in the middle of the night in December, having kept 2 children breathing for 6 hours, he said. "That is a great deal to carry alone." Something moved across her face, not quite pain, not quite surprise, something more like the look of a person who has heard a true thing said aloud that they have never allowed themselves to say aloud themselves. "Someone has to," she said. "Yes," he said, "but it is always you." She looked away, back at the boys, a long pause. "I am good at it," she said, and her voice was a little quieter. "I know what to do. It would be foolish to pretend otherwise or to wait for someone else when I can simply do it. I agree, he said. I am not criticizing you. I am asking who helps you carry it. She did not answer that directly. She smoothed her skirt with one hand in a small automatic gesture and looked at the sleeping children and said, "The boys are doing well." He let it go. He was not a man who pushed where he was not invited, but he had asked the question, and she had heard it, and they both knew it. December wore on. Miss Bauer arrived from San Antonio and was installed in the Carmichael house and declared satisfactory by the parents of Dust Creek after a week of watching her manage their children. The school reopened the second Monday of December, which everyone agreed was a Christmas present to the town. Lionel continued his work on the property, the heavy winter work of mending and preparing that would pay off in the spring. He found reasons to be in town several times a week, which was more often than strictly necessary, and he was honest enough with himself to know why. He began to understand her more as December deepened. He learned that she baked bread every Tuesday and Thursday and left a loaf at the door of Dorothea Marsh, who was elderly and lived alone and would not ask for help under any circumstances. He learned that she had a particular and extensive knowledge of medicinal plants, learned from a Comanche woman named Alma who had lived near Dust Creek for a year when Esther first arrived, and that this knowledge was the reason she had managed the steam treatment for the Finch boys so confidently. He learned that she read seriously and thought carefully and had opinions about things, about the railroad, about territorial governance, about the treatment of the native peoples who had been pushed steadily from this land, that were more developed and more fair-minded than most people in town bothered to form. He also learned that she had been the one to stand between Sarah Finch and the bank when the foreclosure threat was real, had written to the bank manager, and then traveled by herself on the mail stage to the county seat and sat across from the bank manager, and presented her case for Sarah's extension of credit with enough calm authority that the man had been somewhat astonished and had granted a 12-month extension without fully understanding how he had come to do so. He asked her about this one afternoon in December when they were both at the general store at the same time, and the conversation, which had begun as an exchange about winter provisions, had drifted into territory she seemed to find comfortable when she was in a comfortable mood. "You went to the county seat yourself," he said. "Sarah could not go, she had the boys. You could have sent a letter." "I had already sent a letter," she said dryly. "It did not produce the desired result. Some things require a person present." "Were you not nervous?" he asked, not challenging, genuinely curious. She considered this with the honesty he had come to expect. "Yes, a little. Bank managers make a habit of not taking women seriously on matters of finance. I knew I would have to be twice as precise and twice as prepared as a man would need to be." A pause. "It worked." "Of course it worked," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You say that with remarkable confidence for a man who was not there." "I have seen you talk to a room," he said. "I am confident." Something softened in her expression just slightly, like the light shifting in a room when a cloud passes off the sun. "You notice things," she said. "Yes," he said simply. She bought her provisions and he helped her carry them to her wagon, which she accepted without making it either significant or dismissive, just practically, as she did most things. He held the wagon horse's head while she climbed up, and when she gathered the reins she looked down at him and he looked up at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "Thank you, Mr. Donnelly," she said. "Lionel," he said. A pause. "Thank you, Lionel." "Esther," he said. Her name in his voice, said simply, without decoration, seemed to do something. She held the reins and looked at him for a beat longer than was usual, and then she clicked to the horse and drove away down the east road. He stood there in the cold December air and the pale winter sun, and he was aware that something had changed in its direction between them, not dramatically, not with declaration, but certainly. Christmas came to Dust Creek the way it always came to small western towns, with the effort of community making the most of modest circumstances. The church was decorated with pine boughs cut from the ridge and red ribbon that Helen Porter contributed from her own stores. There was a gathering on Christmas Eve, carols sung by whoever could carry a tune and several who could not, mulled cider and gingersnaps, a reading of the Nativity by Reverend Allison in his careful, earnest way. Esther was there, of course. She had organized most of it. She had also, Lionel had heard from young James Calhoun, spent the morning of Christmas Eve bringing food packages to 3 families in town who were having a hard winter, because she had quietly gathered contributions over the previous 2 weeks without announcing that this was what she was doing. He watched her across the church that evening, singing with everyone else, her voice not particularly strong but true, and he thought about the question he had asked her in Sarah Finch's kitchen on that long night. Who do you turn to? She had deflected it, but he did not think she had dismissed it, because Esther Shelton did not dismiss true things. She stored them somewhere and thought about them, he suspected, the same way she thought about everything carefully and honestly without rush. After the gathering, people dispersed into the cold Christmas Eve, calling their good nights, their breath making small clouds in the dark air. Lionel found himself walking beside Esther toward the east end of town, not quite deliberately, not quite accidentally. It was a good evening, he said. It was, she agreed. The Finch boys sang. Caleb has a nice voice when he is not being a tyrant. He is recovered completely then. Fully, thank goodness. A pause. Thank you for what you did that night. I kept a pot of water boiling, he said. You stayed, she said. That is not nothing. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment, their footsteps on the frozen ground the only sound. Do you have family, he asked, for Christmas? Not in Dusk Creek, she said. My sister-in-law is in Virginia, Thomas's sister, but it is too far, we write. I have a brother in Ohio, he said. We were never particularly close. We write at Christmas, and that is enough for both of us. It must have been lonely, she said, and then immediately looked slightly as though she had said more than she intended. It was, he said without embarrassment. Most of the last several years have been fairly lonely. I do not say that as a complaint, it is simply true. She glanced at him. There was a quality in her expression he had not seen before, something tentative, something that was perhaps recognition. Yes, she said quietly, I know what that is. They had reached the junction where her road diverged from his. They stopped. The night was very clear and cold, the stars enormous and indifferent above them, and Dusk Creek was settling into its Christmas quiet around them. Esther, he said. She looked at him. I would like to call on you, he said, properly. If that is something you would consider. The silence stretched. He watched her face in the starlight, which showed him nothing he could be entirely sure of. She had a face that kept its own counsel even when everything else was exposed. You have been calling on me, she said finally, informally. Yes, he said. I would like to do it formally, with your knowledge and consent. Another pause. That is an unusual thing to say. I believe in being clear, he said. I have found that lack of clarity causes a great deal of unnecessary suffering. She looked away toward the dark ridge line. Then she looked back at him. I am a practical person, she said. I do not have patience for things that are not honest. I know that, he said. I am an honest person. I find I want your company. I would like the opportunity to know you more fully and to give you the opportunity to know me. That is all I am asking. She breathed out slowly in the cold air, her breath visible for a moment. Yes, she said. All right. It was perhaps the least romantic acceptance in the history of courtship. He found it completely perfect. January was cold and internal, the kind of month that drove you into yourself. Lionel called on Esther on Sunday afternoons, which was the day she set aside from her work for her own time, and he came with deliberateness and with care, not flowers, which were unavailable and would have seemed performative, but things that were practical and also attentive. A new hinge for her gait that had been dragging and that he had noticed without being asked. A book he had ordered from Abilene, a collection of essays by thinkers she had mentioned in passing, which arrived cold-warped from the mail stage and which he presented without ceremony. A small box of good tea that James Calhoun had brought back from Dallas, because he had heard her mention that the tea available at Horace Dunbar's store was inferior. She received these things with a careful appreciation that was more meaningful than enthusiasm, because it was real. And she returned the gesture in her own way. She had him to supper twice in January, cooking with the same direct competence she applied to everything, and the suppers were simple and good, and the conversations that went with them were the best kind of conversations, the kind where you lose track of time. He learned about Virginia, where she had grown up, the daughter of a schoolteacher mother and a tobacco farmer father, and how the war had changed everything. Her father killed at Chancellorsville in 1863, her mother teaching in a ruined school with half its roof gone, and how Esther herself had been 16 then, old enough to understand exactly what was happening and young enough that it had cut deep into the way she saw the world. She had married Thomas Shelton at 22, followed him to Texas because he had hope about the land and she had hope about him. And the land had been harder than expected, but Thomas had been everything she hoped for. And when he died, she had experienced a grief that was genuine and profound, and then, because she could not afford to stop, she had set herself to the business of continuing. "Did you love him very much?" he asked one evening in January, and it was the kind of question that required the particular safety she had come to feel with him to be asked. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the lamp. "Yes," she said, "in the way you love someone who is truly good. It is a very full love and a very safe love. I have not found a word for what the absence of it is." "I am sorry," he said. "Do not be," she said. "I am grateful for it. Most people do not get what I had." A pause. "Did you have it with someone?" He had been waiting for this. "No," he said honestly. "I was close once, a woman in Kansas, but I was not ready then, too much movement in me, and she needed someone who would stay, which was right, and she found that person. I was not unhappy about it. It was the correct outcome for her. That is a very selfless way to feel about it. I had enough self-awareness to know I was not what she needed. I am not sure that is selflessness." She looked at him. "It is more than most people manage," she said. They were becoming, he thought, something that did not have a word yet, something that was past friendship and not yet quite what it was building toward, a tender and serious middle ground where two careful people circled each other with the particular care of people who knew the cost of making a mistake. Not that either of them thought in terms of mistakes. It was more that they both understood that what was growing between them was worth handling carefully. February came in with a cold wind that rattled the shutters of Esther's house and kept her inside more than she liked. Lionel came on Sunday as usual, and they sat by the fire and she read him a passage from the George Eliot novel that she was still working through. She was a thorough reader, not a fast one, and he listened to her voice reading the sentences and thought that this was, perhaps, as good as he had ever felt sitting in a room with another person. She put the book down midway through a paragraph and looked at him. "You are not listening to the text," she said. "I am listening to you reading it," he said. She held his gaze. Her cheeks were slightly flushed from the fire, and she had a strand of hair that had escaped its pin and lay against her temple, and she looked entirely, completely herself, without performance or pretense, and he thought she was the most genuinely beautiful person he had ever been in a room with. "Lionel," she said, and his name in her voice had a different quality than any other name had ever had in any other voice. "Esther," he said. She set the book aside. She looked at him with that direct, honest regard that he had come to love, and she said, "I am going to tell you something that I have not told anyone." "All right," he said. "I have been alone for 4 years," she said. "Not lonely, alone. I told myself they were the same thing or that one precluded the other, but sitting here with you these past weeks I understand they are different things." He was very still. "I have been afraid," she said. "Not of grief. I know what grief costs, and I would pay it again for Thomas because he was worth it. I have been afraid of—" She stopped, started again. "I have been afraid of needing someone again." because needing someone means they can be absent, and absence in this country is often permanent. Yes, he said, it is. You are not going to argue with me, she said, with something that was almost amusement. You are not going to tell me that it will be fine. I do not know that it will be fine, he said. I know that I intend to stay. I know that I am planting apple trees which take years to produce. I know that you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in a very long time, and I would rather spend whatever time is available with you than protect myself from the cost of it. He paused. But I cannot promise you certainty. No one can. I can only promise you honesty. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire crackled. Ruth and Margaret, her chickens, were audible from the small pen outside, conducting whatever incomprehensible chicken business they conducted in the evening. Honesty, she said. That is enough. He reached across the space between their chairs and she looked at his hand and then she placed hers in it. And they sat there like that in the firelight for a long time, not saying anything at all, which was its own kind of conversation, and perhaps the most important one they had had. March arrived and the land began its slow, stubborn waking. Lionel's south field was breaking beautifully. He had turned it deep through January and February, working the frost into the soil, and the tilth was fine and rich. He planted cotton seed in early March, with the confidence of a man who knew good earth when he turned it. He also planted a small kitchen garden behind the house, and in the northeast corner of the property, along the creek where the soil was deepest and the water table accessible, he planted 6 apple tree saplings that he had ordered from a nursery in East Texas, and that arrived by mail stage in a burlap-wrapped bundle that James Calhoun eyed skeptically. "Those are a long investment," James said. "Yes," Lionel said. Esther came to see them planted. She stood at the edge of the creek bank and watched him heel each sapling into its prepared hole with the particular attention she gave to things that genuinely interested her. 6, she said. That is ambitious for a first season. Some will not take, he said. That is why you plant 6. She handed him the next stake and he drove it beside the tree and tied the young trunk loosely with cloth. Her hand brushed his when she passed the stake and neither of them remarked on it, but he felt it all the way up his arm and she stood very still for a moment after. Spring in Dusk Creek was its own particular beauty, a brief, vivid season of wildflowers and strong light before the summer heat asserted itself. Clara Haynes told Esther, in the way Clara told everyone things, that the whole town was talking about Lionel Donnelly calling on her, and that everyone approved, which Esther acknowledged with a quiet dignity that made it clear she was not conducting her personal life by committee vote. "You are happy," Clara said with some surprise, as though happiness was something she had not expected to see on Esther's face. "I have not seen you happy like this." Esther considered this. "I was happy before," she said. "You were content," Clara said. "That is not the same." Esther thought about this for several days. In the margins between everything else she was doing, which in March included helping Dorothea Marsh when she fell and bruised her hip, organizing a collection of goods for a family who had lost their house to fire 8 miles east, and continuing to correspond with the county school board on Miss Bauer's behalf, because the board's funding decisions were irrational, and someone needed to say so in writing. But in the margins of all of this, she thought about what Clara had said, and she thought about the difference between content and happy, and she thought about the Sunday evenings by the fire and Lionel's hand over hers and the way he looked at her, not as someone to be managed or helped or organized, but simply as herself, all of herself, the parts that were capable and the parts that were tired. He had asked who she turned to. He had asked it quietly and without drama, in a room in the middle of the night with 2 sick children between them, and she had not answered, but the question had lived in her ever since, because it was the question no one else had ever thought to ask. She thought she had found her answer. In April, on a Sunday afternoon when the light was golden and long and the ridge was bright green against the blue sky, Lionel asked her to marry him. He did it simply, standing in her vegetable garden where they had been working side by side planting beans, his hands still in his work gloves, his voice serious and direct, and she thought beautifully unadorned. "I would like to marry you, Esther," he said, "if you are willing. I am not a wealthy man, and I cannot promise you an easy life, but I can promise you that you will never again answer the question of who you turn to with silence." She pulled off one of her gardening gloves and looked at it for a moment. "That is a very particular thing to promise," she said. "It is the most particular promise I know how to make," he said, "because you need it more than you need anything else I have to offer." She looked up at him. His green eyes were steady and warm and completely honest, and she thought of Thomas, who had been good and safe and fully beloved, and she thought that love did not run out. It was not a finite resource that diminished with use, and that the love she was capable of was large enough to encompass both what had been and what was becoming. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." He took her hand, the one without the glove, and held it in both of his, and they stood in the bean rows in the April sunshine, and it was not a dramatic scene. It was not what stories usually looked like, but it was entirely, completely real, and that, she thought, was better than dramatic. They were married in May, on a Saturday afternoon at the Dusk Creek Church, which was decorated with the wildflowers that seemed to exist precisely for this purpose, the blue and yellow, and red that the spring countryside offered freely. Reverend Allison officiated. Clara Haynes cried openly and happily. Sarah Finch stood in the front row with Caleb and Henry, both of whom were dressed in their best clothes and instructed to behave, which they did for approximately the first 15 minutes. Dorothea Marsh sat in a special chair at the end of the front pew because her hip was still tender, and she wore a hat with an enormous purple feather in it that she had been saving for a significant occasion. Esther wore a dress she had made herself from good blue fabric that she had ordered from Abilene, simple and well cut, with her mother's pearl earrings that had traveled from Virginia to Texas in a small leather case, and had never yet been worn to anything as good as this. Her hair was pinned properly, and there was a small cluster of the yellow wildflowers tucked against it, Clara's contribution. Lionel wore a dark coat and a white shirt and had shaved carefully, and when he saw her walking down the aisle, he looked at her with an expression so open and unguarded that half the women in the church felt it secondhand and had to blink fast. The vows were the traditional ones, simple and serious, and when they said them, the church was so quiet that the entire community could hear every word, which was how it should be. They were married before supper time, and Helen Porter had organized a wedding supper in the church hall that was generous and cheerful, and they danced. There was a fiddle player, a rancher named Garrett, who turned out to be remarkably good, until the stars were up and the spring night was cool, and the last of the guests finally walked home to their own lives. They went to the Beaumont property together, Lionel's property, Esther's property now too, their property, and the cotton was coming up in the south field in straight green rows in the moonlight, and the apple saplings along the creek were showing their first true leaves, small and bright and determined, and the house had a lamp burning in the window because Lionel had lit it before leaving for the church because he wanted there to be a light on when they came home. Esther stopped on the porch and looked at the lamp in the window and then at him. "You lit it before you left," she said. "I wanted there to be a light," he said. She put her hand against his chest for a moment, feeling his heartbeat, steady and real. Then she looked up at him with the expression he had come to love best, not the competent expression, not the organizing expression, not even the amused expression, but this one, which was simply her, unmediated, available. He kissed her there on the porch in the May night, properly and thoroughly, and she kissed him back with the same honest directness she brought to everything. And the lamp burned in the window behind them, and the apple trees were putting out leaves along the creek, and the cotton was growing in the south field, and it was, Lionel thought with a contentment so deep it was almost indistinguishable from silence, exactly right. Summer came, and with it the heat, and they worked. Esther moved her chickens, Ruth and Margaret, to the larger property with equanimity. She kept her kitchen garden at the old house going through the summer, borrowing Dorothea Marsh's nephew to check it twice a week, because the garden was productive and the food would feed people. And she maintained her habits of care throughout the town because those habits were part of who she was, and Lionel had never suggested otherwise. What he did do, and what was new, was make sure she was not carrying it alone. When Sarah Finch needed someone in July, the bank met her again. A different account. Another letter needed. Lionel sat at the kitchen table with Esther and helped her draft it, offering his own particular experience of banks and land credit. And the letter they produced together was better than either would have written alone. When Dorothea Marsh's hip worsened in August, and it became clear she needed more care than occasional visiting could provide, it was Lionel who went with Esther to speak with Dorothea's nephew about a more permanent arrangement, standing at her shoulder not to take over but to be present, which made the conversation easier in ways that Esther afterward acknowledged were significant. "It is different," she told him one evening in August, sitting on the porch in the relative cool of 10 o'clock, the sounds of the night around them. "Having someone beside me." "Different how?" he asked because he wanted to hear it said. She thought about it. "Like the difference between standing in moving water alone and standing in it with someone to brace against," she said. "You are not doing the standing for me, but the standing is more possible." He reached for her hand in the dark. "That is all I am aiming for," he said. "I would not want to do the standing for you. I would not know how." She laughed, which was a sound that still every time made something in his chest expand. "No," she said, "you would not." Autumn came and the cotton harvest with it. And it was a good year, not exceptional, but solid and real. And Lionel paid back the credit advance to the land bank with satisfaction and laid in stores for the winter with confidence. The apple saplings had all survived the summer, which James Calhoun declared surprising and Lionel declared inevitable, and they were putting on good growth, the bark thickening, the root systems establishing themselves in the deep creek soil. It was in October, exactly 1 year after Lionel had first bought the Beaumont property and set to work on the porch with a pry bar, that Esther told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, early in the morning, with the coffee made and the light coming in golden through the east window. She said it plainly, as she said everything, watching his face. He put down his coffee cup and looked at her for a long moment, and then he stood up from the table and came around it and held her face in both his hands with a tenderness so total that she felt it like something welling up from inside, and he said, "Are you well?" "Yes," she said, "I am very well." He pressed his forehead to hers. She could feel him breathing. "A child," he said. "Yes, our child." "That is how these things generally work," she said, which was the dry humor he loved, deployed in exactly the right moment to keep the emotion from becoming overwhelming. He laughed and held her properly, his arms around her, her face against his neck, and they stood like that in the kitchen with the coffee getting cold and the morning coming in through the east window and the sounds of Ruth and Margaret conducting their morning affairs outside. "All right," he said eventually into her hair. "Then we have work to do." "We always have work to do," she said. "More specific work," he said. "The room at the back of the house needs a window. I have been meaning to put one in." "You are going to plan the nursery before breakfast," she said. "I am a practical man," he said. "You said so yourself." She pulled back enough to look at his face, and what was on it was so complete and so uncomplicated and so entirely there that she felt, for the first time in a very long time, perhaps the first time since she had been young enough not to know what the world cost entirely, purely, completely seen. Winter came, and with it all the preparations and the growing and the waiting that come with a child on the way. Esther continued her rounds a little modified, a little more careful, and the widows of Dusk Creek who came to her when they needed strength found that she had, if anything, more to give, because being full is not the same as being selfish, and her fullness did not diminish her capacity for others. It deepened it, if anything, because she understood now from the inside, in a new way, what it was to have something worth protecting, worth building, worth continuing for. Lionel was a consistent and thoughtful presence through those winter months. He learned to do the things that needed doing without being asked, which was the highest practical form of love, and he was attentive without being hovering, which required a particular kind of intelligence about another person's character that he had developed carefully over months of paying attention. Clara Haynes, who visited in December when Esther was 6 months along, and had taken on the particular luminous look that some women get in pregnancy, said, "You are different." "I am pregnant," Esther said dryly. "Beyond that," Clara said, "you look rested, you look as though something has been set down." Esther thought about this afterward. It was true. The stone she had carried in her chest for years, the low constant weight of aloneness, was gone. In its place was something warm and present, and she thought, more load-bearing than the stone had been. More load-bearing because it was shared. She thought about her mother, who had taught children to read and write in Virginia, and then in a half-ruined school during the worst years of the war, and she thought about what her mother had told her once, that the things worth doing were the things that required you to show up every day. Teaching was that, farming was that, loving well was that. She showed up every day, so did he. In late January of 1881, their son was born at the Beaumont property with Doc Harriman in attendance and Clara Haynes present, because she was the most sensible woman in Dust Creek and had attended 2 births previously and did not faint. It was a long night and an honest struggle, and Esther was not quiet about the difficulty of it, which Clara afterward told everyone was the most reassuring thing because Esther, being human, was somehow the most comforting evidence that all of them were allowed to be human too. The boy arrived at 3 in the morning, loud and red-faced and entirely determined, and Lionel, who had been in the main room with Doc Harriman after being removed from the birthing room at Esther's direction because she said his hovering was not useful, was brought in to find his wife exhausted and bright-eyed and holding a small wrapped person against her chest. "Come here," she said. He came. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she placed the baby in his arms with the careful confidence of a woman who had held other people's children and knew how it was done. And he looked down at this small, particular, new person and felt something so primary and wordless that he did not try to name it. "Hello," he said to the baby. The baby blinked at him with the unfocused, ancient gaze of the newborn, unimpressed and absolute. "He has your eyes," Esther said. "Green, I can already tell." "He has your chin," Lionel said, "which means he will be stubborn." "Determined," she corrected. "Determined," he agreed. They named him William Thomas Donnelly, William for no particular family member, simply because it was a good solid name, and Thomas because Esther said it was right to carry forward what had been good, and because Thomas Shelton had been good, and goodness deserved to be remembered. Lionel agreed without hesitation, which was one of the things she loved about him, that he was not threatened by her past or by the love she had before him, because he understood, as generous people do, that love was not a competition. Spring came back and William Thomas Donnelly grew and was loud and vigorous and opinionated from the first weeks, which everyone agreed was entirely appropriate given his parentage. Esther managed motherhood the way she managed everything, with intelligence and without sentimentality about the harder parts, and with a thoroughness that made the soft parts, when they came, more real for being unforced. Sarah Finch's boys, Caleb and Henry, came to visit regularly that spring because they were 4 and 6 and drawn to the baby with the particular fascination that slightly older children have for smaller ones. And Henry, who was 4, sat beside William's cradle for 20 minutes one afternoon with the gravity of a man with serious business, simply watching, and reported afterward that the baby looked like a potato. Esther laughed so hard at this that she had to sit down, which was something she allowed herself more frequently now. The school continued. Miss Bauer had settled well, and the children of Dust Creek were receiving a proper education. The apple trees along the creek were in their 2nd year of growth and doing well, putting on the growth that would, in another few years, produce the first fruit. Lionel tended them with the patience he had promised, the long-term patience of a man who intended to stay. There was a drought scare in the summer of 1881, a dry July that worried everyone, but the creek held enough through August, and the cotton came through reduced but not destroyed. They had prepared for hard years, put aside enough from the first good harvest to carry them through a lean one, which was the kind of foresight that came from two people thinking together rather than one person carrying it alone. In the evenings that summer, after William was down and the heat was beginning to ease, Esther and Lionel sat on the repaired porch. The porch he had rebuilt with a pry bar on his first days here, the first evidence of intention, and talked or were quiet together. And sometimes she read to him, and sometimes he told her about the places he had been before he stopped moving, the wide grasslands and the mountain passes, and the cities that smelled like coal and iron. And she listened with the attention she gave to everything that genuinely interested her. "Do you miss it?" she asked once. "The moving," he thought honestly. "I miss the sight of new country," he said. But not the absence of a place to come back to. He looked at the porch, the yard, the line of the south field in the dusk. "This is the place I come back to." She leaned against him slightly, her shoulder against his arm, which was a gesture of such easy intimacy that it still, every time, felt like a gift. "Good," she said. 2 years passed with the rhythm of working land and raising a child, and being part of a community that was small enough to know everything about everyone and large enough to have something worth knowing. William learned to walk and then to run, and then to pursue the chickens, which Ruth and Margaret bore with the dignity of birds who had seen worse. He was a serious boy with his father's green eyes and his mother's particular directness, and he said what he meant and meant what he said from an early age, which was either going to make him a fine man or an exasperating one, and possibly both. Dorothea Marsh died in the winter of 1882, peacefully and in her own bed, attended by her nephew and Esther, who sat with her through the last afternoon and held her hand and told her, when Dorothea asked, that she had been a woman worth knowing, which was true, and that Dusk Creek would remember her, which it did. Esther organized the funeral and the burial and the letters to Dorothea's distant relations, and then she came home and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands flat on the table and her head bowed. And Lionel came and stood behind her with his hands on her shoulders and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say, and she leaned back against him, and that was enough. Miss Bauer, the schoolteacher, married a rancher from 12 miles north in the spring of 1883, and the question of the school arose again briefly, but she chose to keep teaching and simply commuted to town on teaching days, which the school board accepted because she was excellent and they were not going to find better. Esther had argued this position to the county school board in another trip to the county seat, this time with Lionel, who contributed his own forceful opinion about the value of retaining a proven teacher over principal, and the board had conceded. On the way home from that trip, sitting on the mail stage with the county seats dust behind them and the familiar ridges of Dusk Creek country coming up ahead, Esther looked at him and said, "You argued that very well." "I had good notes," he said. "Yours. You expanded on them." "We make a reasonable team," he said. She looked out the window at the late afternoon land, the dry grass and the distance and the particular quality of Texas light that she had come to understand was beautiful even when it was harsh. "Yes," she said, "we do." In the autumn of 1883, their daughter was born. She arrived more quickly than William had and with more opinions, announcing herself at 6 in the morning, with a force that made Doc Harriman raise his eyebrows. They named her Ruth Mary Donnelly Ruth for Esther's mother and the chicken who had by now become something of a family legend, and Mary for no one in particular except that it was a good name and sat well beside Ruth. Lionel held her in the early morning light with the same wordless completeness he had felt holding William, and then he looked at Esther, who was tired and entirely herself, and looking at him with the full, honest, open regard that he would never stop being grateful for, and he said, "Hello, Ruth Mary." The baby blinked at him with her mother's brown eyes, decisive and present. "She is already analyzing the situation," he said. "Good," Esther said. "She will need to." They looked at each other over the baby's head, and between them was 4 years of actual life. The work and the worry and the dry summers and the cold nights and the sick children and the lost neighbors and the long conversations and the comfortable silences and the apple trees that were, now, entering their productive years, beginning to set their first tentative fruit in the creek-cool northeast corner of the property. Between them was the question asked in the dark of Sarah Finch's kitchen, and the answer that had taken years to finish saying, but was now fully and completely said. William turned 3 that winter and demanded to know everything about Ruth Mary with the relentless inquiry of a toddler, and was reported by Clara Haynes to have told Henry Finch that his baby sister was very loud, but that this was acceptable because she was his. Esther laughed when she heard this, the full, real laugh. Clara watched her, the same surprise and pleasure that had been in her face 2 years ago when she had said "you are happy," and something more now, something that was the look of a person watching a thing they had hoped for come completely true. "You are settled," Clara said. Esther thought about the word. Content versus happy versus settled. None of them quite right on their own. All of them together, perhaps. "I am home," she said. It was the truest thing she knew. Spring arrived again, and the apple trees bloomed for the first time, 6 trees along the creek, their white blossoms a sudden extravagance in the working landscape, smelling of something so clean and hopeful that Esther stood under them one morning in April with Ruth Mary on her hip and William, pulling at her skirts demanding to pick one, and she looked up through the branches at the sky and felt the completeness of it with her whole body. Lionel came from the south field and saw her standing there and stopped at the edge of the creek, looking at her through the trees, and he thought, as he still thought, every so often, with the particular gratitude of a man who had been lonely for years and knew what that cost, that he had asked the right question. Not because the asking had been brave or romantic or calculated, but because it was the question she had needed someone to ask, and because in asking it he had told her, more clearly than any declaration, that he saw her, all of her, the capable and the tired and the necessary and the private and the large-hearted and the quietly, indomitably enduring. He walked through the blossoming trees to where she stood and took Ruth Mary from her hip because she was heavy and Esther had been carrying her since breakfast, and he settled the baby against his own shoulder, and she grabbed his collar with her small decisive fist, and William immediately required his father's other hand, and Esther stood beside them in the apple blossom morning free, for a moment, of every weight except her own. She looked at Lionel. He looked at her. "They are blooming," she said. "They are," he said. "First year. You said some would not take," she said. "All 6 took," he said. "You sound surprised." "Pleased," he said. "Not surprised. I planted them in good ground." She took his arm, the one not occupied by Ruth Mary, and leaned slightly against him, and they stood there together under the blossoming trees, while William found an interesting stick and became deeply occupied with it. And the creek ran its quiet course through the northeast corner of the land they had built together, and the morning held them in its clear April light, and everything that had needed to be resolved was resolved, and everything that had needed to be built was standing. And the story of Esther Shelton and Lionel Donnelly was not finished. It would not be finished for a long time, and there would be more seasons and more hard summers and more cold nights and more neighbors who needed something and more conversations by lamplight and more Sunday mornings and more children's voices and more apple harvests. But it had found its shape, its true and lasting shape, and that shape was this. 2 people who had each learned to carry much, carrying it together, side by side, in the good ground of a life built honestly from the beginning. That was enough. That was everything.